Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis, volume 2. We concluded the paragraph on page 1165, Aleph Kuf Samachay. So this was basically a 2-page analysis and explanation of the Koiches HaNefesh in comparison to the Nefesh. The faculties of our souls, the faculties of the Nefesh, of our spirit, and the soul, as going to be a moshel. With this, he's going to explain what Atzilus is like. So briefly, what did we learn? That there's a certain dual characteristic when we talk about the faculties. On one hand, they're faculties of the soul. They're not outside forces. They're not, for example, taking a hammer or another instrument and using it. The faculties are extensions of the soul, whether it's the power to see, koyach hariyah, or koyach hashmiya, the power to hear, or koyach haseichel, the power of intellect, which was the main faculty he's been addressing here, because it's the top faculty, meaning the first and the essence of all the source of all faculties, as we explained, intellect. All of them are faculties of the soul. They're not outside elements. They're not what we would call a levush hanifrid. Because as he's explaining here, the difference between two types of garments, a separate garment would be like a jacket, a shirt. But the faculties of the soul are extensions of the soul. At the same time, however, they're not the etzem of the neshama, of the soul. Because the soul is indivisible, is not a sum of the parts of the faculties. And he went back and forth explaining both sides of it. That on one hand, it's not the etzem hanefesh, or what he called atzmus muhus hanefesh. And on the other hand, just you're looking at the words, the exact expression. And on the other hand, it's not outside of the nefesh, meaning its function, it creates a function outside of who you are. Because with your faculties, you can interact with the world around you, but it itself is an extension of the faculties of the soul itself. That was basic. So that he called that a levush atzmi. A levush atzmi. Or as he explained the example where he said of by hadein kamtza shalevushe minei ubei. Okay. So good. Now let me just see what else I want to review from here. And he gave the example in a body, you find the same thing, that there's a body that is not the soul. It's made up of flesh, skin and flesh, and yet it becomes completely united with the soul. Where you see one human being that's made up of body and soul. Okay. The final point he made, that the faculties come b'derech hischatzus min hanefesh. There's something new about them, because the nefesh itself is higher than the faculties. It's higher than intelligence or emotions or any faculties of the human being. So and that's why the koyach hamaskil, the power to conceive, is not something that we can tangibly, or he says we don't feel it, because it's not yet an existing intelligence. It's only the power of intelligence. On the other hand, he says it's not ischatzus mamish, because we do sense that intelligence comes from somewhere. We just don't know where it comes from, and we don't understand and feel the exact entity. But mergish makom mokum shenimshich meizabok, not like yesh ma'ayin. Yesh ma'ayin is ischatzus mamish, because the yesh doesn't feel at all that there's a source. Here, the faculties know that's coming from somewhere. They're aware of that. They just don't know where that place is because it's beyond them. So there again, you see this balance, this dance between, is it an existent entity with structure, and yet at the same time, it is, which is lower than the nefesh itself, and at the same time, it's part of the nefesh and an extension of it. Yesterday, I explained why this is sometimes hard to fully digest, because we think of things from the bottom up. And you have to think of things from the top down, where atzmus, I'm talking about now godliness, is beyond any structure. Structure is a superimposed entity that comes after the fact. We start life by seeing a structure, and then we're trying to retrace the steps where this all comes from. But when you think of it, that's exactly how it works. The nefesh precedes the faculties. First you have a nefesh, a neshama. Then you have the faculties that extend from it. So now he's going to come and explain how this helps us understand Atzilus and the levushim, what we spoke in Pesach Eliyahu, the levushim of Atzilus in contrast to the levushim of Biyah. Where in Atzilus we call it Tafikas Eser Tikunin, and in Biyah he says levushim Tikinuslan. That's the beginning of the paragraph on page 1164. So now he's going to come back and explain from all this the 10 spheres of Atzilus, that on one hand they are elikus, on the other hand they are lower than the etzem of elikus. So the 10 spheres, as we learned at length in volume 1, are God's instruments, but they're not outside of godliness, because iyu v'chayu echad, iyu v'gamu echad, which is the whole theme here of discussing whether Atzilus is Das Elyon. Now he's going to explain how Atzilus is Das Elyon and Das Tachten. But if you may recall, the beginning, he first started that the whole thing is Das Elyon. Why? Because even though there's Eser Spheres, their focus is not on their function, their focus is on God's emanation. They're expressing Chesed of Atzilus is Chesed of Elikus. Gvura of Atzilus is Gvura of Elikus, like we learned in the beginning of the Maimer on page 1161 and on. Yeah, that the Ayin. Right. But then, as he elaborated, he developed and said, but on the other hand, Atzilus also has it's already an Elam Hatzilus. It has already a structure. So now he's explaining how there's both structure and there's also the element of a divine aspect of it that gives it the sense of the Ayin of the Yesh Amiti, and it also has the Ayin of the Yesh Hanivra. But let's not jump. We'll get to that as we continue learning this topic. Okay, unless someone has a question, I'm going to start learning now from the beginning of the paragraph on the bottom of page 1165.
Rabbi, I have a quick question.
Go ahead.
Yitzchak Weiner. So are we saying that all intelligence is...
Just say one second. There seems to be... We'll get to that as we continue learning this topic. Okay, unless someone has a question, I'm going to start learning now from the beginning of the paragraph. I have to just shut the sound here 1 second. Okay, go ahead. Sorry about that.
Are we saying that all intelligence is a manifestation of this Atzilus, of the sort of the godliness of the neshama, all intelligence, all human intelligence? Are we saying so as distinguished, which is, let's say, instinctive intelligence, like nefesh behema? Well, the behema has a certain amount of intelligence. It's not because that's not coming from a neshama, versus creative intelligence, which you might say is like godly. So are we saying all human intelligence is a manifestation of the neshama?
No, we're not saying any of that, because all that is not the theme here at all. I'm not sure where we're learning a mimer here, discussing a particular topic. What you're addressing now is a completely different topic that's not discussed here. Okay, so I'm not sure what you're asking me about.
Then I'll have to take it offline with you. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. So all questions are, 1 second, please.
Well, I'm jumping into your share in the middle of something you've been doing for many weeks, and it's not right for me to disrupt the class. So maybe it'd be better if I did it offline.
You're not the only one that does it, so don't worry about it. Excuse me. My point is this. I want to make a point, since you and others are maybe coming. In learning a mimer, there's always going to be touching upon a lot of different themes that were learned, that are discussed in other places. As the steward of this class, I try to steer the class to focus on what we're learning here. But there's always going to be questions that come up from something else you learned, or something that you pick up from a certain line, which is fine. So sometimes, if I feel it's appropriate to fit into this, we'll discuss it. If not, I'll point out what you're discussing is definitely a different subject matter.
Okay.
which is fine. So I'm saying it because I have said it many times in this class. So you don't have to apologize.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. So now he says like this. When we call there, Yuvan Hadugma, Be'eses Sefiros of Atzilus. From all of the above that we just learned about the Keiches HaNefesh, if you recall, if you go back to page 1164, like the sixth line from the beginning of the paragraph, he says, "V'yuvan zel derech moshel Keiches HaNefesh." So now he's going back. That whole came to explain the levushim of Atzilus. So now he said, after all this that we just discussed, from the example of the Keiches, we'll understand Hadugma be'eses Sefiros of Atzilus, in the 10 spheres of Atzilus. Shein b'chinas levushim levad. They're called only levushim, garments. And a garment, by definition, means not the core essence. When you say a garment, you mean saying something you're enclothing the essence in. If you put on a garment, that's what definition of garment is. And yet we said that Atzilus is Iyur v'chayu echad, Iyur v'gamu echad. It's all elikus. So how do we explain that? So now, with this mashal of the Keiches HaNefesh, we're going to understand both sides of the coin. They're only garments to the infinite light of the emanator, of the source. That's what the 10 spheres of Atzilus are. That's why the Pasuk Eliyahu said, "Antu chad v'lei b'chushban," you are one, not a measurable one. Antu dafikas eset tikunin, you're the one that afikas from you emerged 10 garments. Remember the top of page 1164, he types tikunin is levushim. So they're garments, essentially divine garments. God is dressing himself up in garments to manifest himself in the structure of existence, which is the essence Sefiros. So he's bringing a medrash that says, or maybe a Gemara even, that God enclosed himself, manifested himself in 10 garments. So he's using that to explain the 10 spheres as garments. So why is it called a garment? He says, "V'hu rak mash'ein sof mizgal al yadan upoil al yadan lanhaga b'han almin." Because this is not Ein Sof on its own; it's how Ein Sof is revealed through these garments, and affects reality through these garments. Lanhaga b'han almin, to govern and rule the worlds, which means all of existence. So, like I give the mashal with the artist. The artist himself is beyond the art he creates, but for him to create art, he needs to manifest as an artist with a distinct and defined form of art, which we'll call the 10 spheres, and therefore he manifests in it. So it's like Ein Sof manifesting in these garments to create and govern and the world's existence. The zehu, and this is due to the fact, this is due to the fact, Ein Sof mis'alim bahem val yodam. This is due. How does this happen? Is because Ein Sof cannot be in its full intensity. If the artist is in full intensity with all infinite possibilities, he's not going to create one piece of art. If Ein Sof would remain in its pure state, like in the mashal it's a nefesh, not manifesting in faculties, and you wouldn't have Basar Maimaris Nivra Elam, the 10 statements with which God creates Yehi Er, Yehi Rakia, you would have a complete shapeless and undefined divine energy without structure. It would not create a structure. So the only way this is possible is that Ein Sof is misalim, conceals itself within and through the spheres. Within them, he covered himself from human beings, from Bnei Nasha, from people. So it's like thinking of like this, that if the light was just what's the word I want to say? Unfettered and untethered, unfettered light, and it would not manifest in a lavush, in a garment, we would not be able to experience it. So what does the Melech do? In this case, Melech Malchei Amlochim, what does the divine infinite energy do? It dresses itself in a garment. And in it, it conceals itself from its subjects, from Bnei Nasha, from people. This expression of Beis Chassidus, I'm not sure, it's probably a Zohar. I don't think it's in Pasuk Eliyahu.
It is.
It is? Okay, so then he's okay, okay. So then he's using further, it's a medrash, yeah. The Asar Levushim. Yeah. Okay, so then so then really this piece of Maimed is also coming to analyze Pasuk Eliyahu, a lot of different phrases in Pasuk Eliyahu. You're right. Now I remember. It's a little later. Yeah. Okay. V'hainu. So what does this mean? V'hainu. B'zeh shehem b'bchinas mitzias madregas. So he's explaining it in specific detail. How does this concealment happen? The fact that the Sefiros are mitzias madregas ubegdarim yuchadim, they are existing levels. When you say Chachma of Atzilus, Bina, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, etc., they are mitzias madregas. We're not talking about undefined states. It's defined. Chachma is not Bina. And Gdarim Yuchadim, they each have their parameters. So they're existing entities, distinct entities. They're not physical, but it's like a mind, emotions, etc. And Gdarim Yuchadim. B'zeh misalama erein sof. In this structure, so he's spelling it out, mamish in Rachel Bitcha Ktana, in this defined structure. In this, the Erein Sof, the infinite divine, conceals himself in this. The Erein Sof on its own, the infinite divine light on its own, who b'bchinas pshitas be'etzem, is fundamentally shapeless. Pshitas here is the opposite of Geder and Metzias. Shapeless, no definitions. You can't call it Chachma, Bina, Lav Inun Midas Iyu Klal. Completely not defined by any definitions and parameters. Sefiros of Atzilus, and the Gili of Erein Sof itself, it didn't have, without the Levushim, without these instruments, so to speak, without these garments, who Kamoishahu, the B'chinas Pshitis, it's exactly the way it is. So in other words, if Erein Sof did not do anything, if it just flowed freely, without imposing and applying any type of garment, structure, tzimtzum, helam, and so on, it would be a Gil in a state of shapelessness, and what would be obvious and revealed would be power of Ein Sof, which means everything would be infinite energy. There'd be no structure at all. Va'esa Sefiros, and the 10 spheres, shehein bebchinas mitzias dover, they are a mitzias dover, they are an existing entity. Obviously, it's an entity that God put into place. Hari misalim bezeh, in this gets concealed, and these spheres are concealed, koyecha Ein Sof apshitus, the power of Ein Sof and this shapelessness of Ein Sof. So it's interesting. He doesn't say that the pshitus and the Ein Sof disappear. He just says they are concealed within the garments. So let's go back with the mashal. When the artist creates that one piece of art, within it lies all his power, even the power of the infinite possibilities. We just don't see it. We only see one art. You see a world. But in this world is invested koyecha Ein Sof and koyecha pshitus, but it's concealed. And what we see is we see it through the channel of the Sefiros. That's why we see a structure. And that's where both things come together. So he says it's misalim b'teich akeich ensef in the Sefiros. Yeah. Okay.
This is the levushim atzmim, no?
He didn't spell it out yet. We'll get there. He's going to spell it out. Yeah. Yes, that's what it is. Yeah, the Sefiros are levushim atzmim. They're levushim on one hand because not ein sof atzmei. Remember, the nefesh is poshet. It doesn't have. It's higher than faculties, but the garments are garments of the nefesh. Like in this case, the art of the artist is still art of this artist. It's not a separate entity. It's the artist expressing himself through a particular way. You know, to put it in different words, when the Rebbe would speak a sikha, or Moshe Rabbeinu spoke when he came down from Har Sinai, he said specific words, right? He said, "Bereishis bar alikim, teiret sivalon Moshe, Shema Yisrael," whatever it may be. These are words that every person can understand the meaning. It's structured words. Shema Yisrael is not the same pasuk like teiret sivalon Moshe, for example, but it's still coming from Moshe's Dvar Hashem. Dvar Hashem in a structure. That's the key point. Now, if he was saying his own, if you say your own words, it's not Shechina Medaberes Meteich Greinei. So then you're saying your own words. That's not a levush atzmi. That's a levush anifrit, because then you're saying your words. But if you are saying God's words, but they're words at the same time they're godly, you have both sides to the coin here. God said Yehi Yehi Rakia. Not human beings didn't say that. Dash Eberster said it. So as the Eberster, Ein Sof, packaging himself in defined words or defined expressions, here defined Sefiros, called the defined levushim. That's how you have to envision what's going on here. Okay? Good.
He's saying here, the Korean loin asar Sfiron, lanhog evoin almin sesimen, ve'almin dis galion, ve'hoin iskisias mibnei nosho.
Okay, so it fits perfectly. Yeah. Then notice he manifested himself, he expressed himself through 10 Sefiros, 10 levushim, and in them is concealed the Ein Sof Shabazah. Yeah. That's the meaning of the Pasuk Aliyah. Exactly right. Okay, now he's going to bring from a commentary. Remember, you maybe remember Sefer Hadras Melech from Buzila. It was mentioned here before on page 1162. We spoke about that Atzilus is the Elam, the Heichalis. So he says, Ubesefer Hadras Melech, Kosav. Sefer Hadras Melech, as I mentioned, is a commentary on Zohar and on Tikkunei Zohar. So he says, there he writes on the expression that we're saying here. This expression of Bohun, Iskasias, in them he concealed himself, he covered himself. This is what the Hadras Melech writes, Sefer Hadras Melech. The Ein Sof mislabish toich yechida da'ak. It's a little Kabbalistic, but I'll explain it. Ein Sof, remember we're talking about Ein Sof, the infinite. Mislabish toich, he dressed himself up, he enclothed himself in yechida of Adam Kadmon. So Adam Kadmon, like all worlds, has 5 nefesh, ruach, neshama, chay, yechida. So the yechida of Ak. And then the Ak manifested and dressed himself up in Atik, Ba'atik, Ba'arich. So basically, he explains that with that the Pasuk Eliyahu is saying, Ubohonis Kasiyas, he's talking about 3 levels of concealment. Ein Sof into Yechida of Ak into Atik, and Atik into Arich. So just to give you the geographic, if you wish, location of this, as you know, after the Tzimtzum comes the Kav. The first so-called world is Adam Kadmon. After Adam Kadmon comes Akudim, Nekudim, Vrudim. But sometimes we jump Ak, then Keser of Atzilus, and then Atzilus. So you'd say that Keser is made up of Atik and Arich. So here he says that the Ein Sof is mislabish in the Yechida of Adam Kadmon. Adam Kadmon is mislabish b'teich Atik, and Atik and Arich. So essentially it's, like if you want, you can call 3, I'm not going to say 3 garments, he doesn't use that expression, but it's definitely what he just said. And the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain now. Vahainu. Remember, here in the Maimer, he typed Iskasias is going on the Sefiros. that the Eibishter dressed up the Sefiros, that he said that Antu the Fikus Eser Tikunim V'Krinlan Eser Sfirin Lan Hogabain Alman, and those Sefiros are, that's where within them he concealed Ein Sof. The Hadis Melech spells it out in more detail in the levels of Ak, Atik, and Arich. So the Rebbe Rashab is going to explain. V'hainu, this means Shemisalam Ha'ed Ein Sof B'Slapshusi Behem. Because the word that the Hadis Melech uses, he uses mislabish. So not only is it dressing it up, but it's explaining the word iskasias, which means to conceal. It seems like he's bringing also proof that how do you know that dressing in a garment is a concealment? So he's saying clearly that the fact that he dressed himself up in these situations, that's the meaning of the concealment. That he's concealing himself in the garment. I'll tell you the truth. I see that he's not explaining the Hadis Melech per se. So then he just bring it as a support to the whole story here. The Hadis Melech obviously is not a stira, because the word is kasir, that within it he concealed can mean many levels of concealment. But bottom line is, we see that the meaning of the Tikkun Pasach Aliyah, the Tikkun Zayar, is that there's a garment here and there's a concealment going on. He's not focusing on the levels Ak, Atik, Arich. But our bottom line is, at the end of the day, it gets concealed also in the 10 spheres. What I would say is after Atik, after Ak, and then Atik, and then Arich, come then the Sefiros of Atzilus. So what you see here is that there again are progressive stages. It's not just a jump from Ein Sof to the 10 spheres. It goes through stages here, through Ak and through the other levels. Yeah. Good. Okay, so now we continue on here. V'hainu, the last line on page 1165. V'hainu, mashe Eidin Sof bo b'bchinas Chochmah. This is referring to Eidin Sof that comes into Chochmah. Remember, we said Chochmah was the first.
Can I ask a quick question?
Go ahead.
Is this related to Hishtasis? Is this sort of a manifestation of Hishtasis, or is that also something totally different than what he's talking about?
Hishtalshlus refers to the entire cosmic order. Okay. This is talking about a part of Hishtalshlus.
Okay. Thank you.
If you remember, on the top of page 1162, and then later again, Chochmah is the first place where Ein Sof manifests. Like Perek Lamed Hey in the Hagah, he said then that Chochmah is Hu Levade Hu Ve'ein Zolose. Yeah. So he's saying now, this is how Ein Sof comes into Chochmah. It's not a contradiction to Ak, Atik, and Arich, because at the end of the day, it has to come into the spheres. So he says, this is how Ein Sof comes into Chochmah. Upoyel Pu'ulas, next page, 1166. Upoyel Pu'ulas HaChochmah Al-Yidei HaChochmah D'Atzilus. So now that we've established that the way the Ein Sof works is it manifests in the garments, and in them and through them gets concealed, and then can serve the function. So specifically, that means as Ein Sof comes into Chochmah. Now, what's happening next? The Ein Sof flows through Chochmah of Atzilus. So now, if the Ein Sof didn't have garments, there'd be no Chochmah. Now that the Ein Sof manifests, now like the artist, he's using so-called the paintbrush or the instrument of Chochmah to poil Chochmah in existence. The instrument, the sphere of Bina, to poil Bina. So now we have two things. We have an Ein Sof, it's dressed up and concealed inside of the garments of the spheres, and each garment, through it, the Ein Sof works its way to poil certain particular function, Chochmah Bina, which creates the diversity and the structure of existence. So essentially, the 10 spheres of Atzilus are essentially God's instruments. Channels is even better. Channels to channel Ein Sof into structured existence. And he begins with Chochma, Idea Chochma Atzilus. And now he goes back to the Moshel. Remember, the Nefesh is the Moshel for Ein Sof. The Koiches HaNefesh are the Moshel for the 10 spheres. So he says, U'kamoisha HaNefesh maskelas al yedei koich HaSeichel. U'kafi eifun koich HaSeichel. Just like we said, the Nefesh itself is higher than Seichel. But it manifests because it wants to express itself. So it manifests in Chochmah, and that's why it's called Nefesh HaMaskelas. So the Nefesh is now working through Seichel. It's Nimshach, it's drawn through Seichel, and Ukifi Eifen Koich HaSeichel. Not just through it, passing through, but it's also being shaped by Seichel. So when someone expresses themselves with intelligence, it's the Ein Sof of the Nefesh expressing itself through the garment, the attached garment called Seichel, and expressing itself through intelligence. When the Nefesh expresses itself through Midas, it's Midas. But as we spoke, Nefesh HaMaskelas much more reflects the Nefesh than does other faculties, because it's the highest level of the faculties. And it's most united with the Nefesh. Okay. And now back to the 10 spheres. Visavusam. And the coming into being, Me'ein Sof, from Ein Sof, the 10 spheres, how their emergence, Afikoslan, they emerged from Ein Sof, who b'chinas Ischachus. Remember in the Moshel, the back of the last page, we just learned that they're a form of Ischachus here. There's something new happening here. Because if it was pure Ein Sof, there's nothing new about that. You need something here that's additional. You may remember in volume 1, he spoke a lot about whether Atzilus is Gilead Helam or Yesh Ma'ayin. And first he said that the Kalim are Yesh Ma'ayin and the Eir is Gilead Helam. But then he said the Eir is also Yesh Ma'ayin, Chochma Ma'ayin Timotza. Why? Because Es Ein Sof is not defined by Sefiros. So the fact that their structure is a Chiddush. It's not just Ein Sof flowing and suddenly turns into structure. So the Chiddush is a Chiddush here. U'kamei v'achachma ma'ayin timotza. We say Chachma comes from Ayin. And b'bchinas mitziyah. He's focusing also on the word mitziyah. Sha'chachma eina margish mekeira. So both the word, I'll explain in a moment. Ma'ayin timotza, both of them reflect something that is Chiddush. Chachma does not sense its source. It senses there is a source, but it does not sense what that source is. Like he explained before. Now, what does he mean by mitzvah here? So he says, first of all, Chachma ma'ayin already tells you. Chassidus teaches ma'ayin, like yesh ma'ayin. It comes from, Chachma is a yesh in this sense, and it comes from ma'ayin, from a place that's beyond it. But the word timotza is also an interesting word. You could have said v'chochma ma'ayin nisave, or chochma ma'ayin. There's a lot of words. Timotza comes from the word mitzia. A mitzia, when you find an object that is like it's a pitera, that's the whole elam mitzia. There's a whole sugya about what is a mitzia. So the Gemara says in Sanhedrin that 3 things come by hesach hadas. Hesach hadas means it's a surprise. It comes that when you're not thinking about it, it just suddenly appears. One is a mitzvah. You're walking in the street and you suddenly see $100, or you see a bundle of figs, whatever it may be. That's a mitzvah. Why? Because it's not an expected reality. It's like a mitzvah. Where did it come from? A chiddush. It's a surprising entity. The other 2 are Mashiach, and the third, well, it's Akriv and Mashiach. I'm not going to get into the comparison of the 3, but Mashiach also says David. What's the love? He brings the raya there. The Ish David, Matzasi Ish David, from the word Matzasi.
Matzasi David Avdi in Tehillim Peters.
Right, Matzasi David Avdi. Sorry, but the word Matzasi. What is the word Matzasi? I found him. What do you mean you found him? Because finding something is like a surprise. That's why he's saying it's like in a form of mitzvah that you don't know where it's from. The mitzvah, it doesn't tell you who the owner is. That's why it's a mitzvah. You found it. Now, if you find a siman, you can maybe identify the owner. But in general, a mitzvah is something that does not identify its source, its owner.
untraceable.
Yeah, why not? So what is he saying? V'hainu, and this means the Yisavas Atzilus, who are Yidei Hatzimtzum, the Ein Sof. The creation or the bringing into being of Atzilus is through the concealment of Ein Sof. In other words, if Ein Sof was revealed completely, you wouldn't have this Chochmah Ma'ayin Timotza. The fact that there's a structured Chochmah means that Ein Sof concealed itself, because the owner, so to speak, is concealed, Ein Sof, and it's concealed. Therefore, Chochmah does not feel the actual source, because you have a leap here from the Ein Sof to the Sefiros. And now he goes the other side of the coin. U'makol mokem, nevertheless, Einei b'chinas ischatshus mamish. This is not a state of total, a new entity totally. Not like yesh ma'ayin mamish. Sha'es Sefiros d'Atzilus, because the 10 spheres of Atzilus, hein elikus, mamish. They're mamish divine. They're not all of the divine. They're not the infinite divine, but they're divine entities. Chochmah is not Chochmah of the human being, it's Chochmah of elikus. Same thing with Bina and so on. So the elikus mamish. Umuyuchadim b'tachlis be'erein seif baruch hu. And they're utterly united in the infinite divine Baruch Hu. Why? Because they're not created like Yesh Ma'ayin. The Yesh of this world doesn't at all reflect a divine force. We don't sense any source altogether. It's a Yesh. It sees itself as self-contained. Chochmah of Atzilus and all the Sefiros are not that way, but they're b'chinas kiruv. She'einan b'chinas mahus acher. They didn't become a separate personality. They're still of the personality of the divine. However, as the divine conceals itself and dresses up in the garments, when you say Yehi Oyer, the Eibishter says Yehi Oyer, is that not divine? That's divine words. However, they're words, but they're still totally divine. They're not something outside of Elikus. Whereas when we speak, that's us speaking, not the Eibishter speaking.
Like you said before, that it's not a ischatshus mamesh, הרי מרגיש מכל מקום שנמשך מאיזה מקור.
That's right. Because Chachma Bin, all the spheres of Atzilus are completely like a Merkava. They completely, the only thing, they're functioning only what God wants them to do. They don't have any separate identity. So what's the Chiddush Shebezeh is that they're not all of Elikus. They're not the Bligvul of Elikus. They are one, they are 10 channels. Ulachein, and therefore, Ha'eses Sefiros d'Atzilus, the 10 spheres of Atzilus, same b'chinas mamutza. That's why they serve as a mamutza, as an interface. Bein ha'bligvul u'b'chinas ha'gvul. Between the infinite, without limits, without the infinite, and the finite, and the gvul, the limited. Why? Mipnei shebe'eses Sefiros. Because the 10 spheres, yesh Beis ha'inyonim. It has both sides to it. Shehem b'b'chinas hagbala u'b'b'chinas hagbala b'b'chinas mitzias davar. On one hand, they are defined. They're hagbala. They are parameters, and they're existing entities. U'makol makim. On the other hand, nevertheless, heim b'b'chinas alakus mamish. They're mamish alakus, these entities. So this is, when you think about it, it's very eloquent, because you have here God is not limited to bli gvul. The divine is not limited to infinite Ein Sof. Just as he expresses himself in infinite possibilities, he can also express himself in one possibility, or in this case, one possibility, one picture of 10 elements, 10 facets. That doesn't make it less divine. It just makes it not Ein Sof as in Bleakville, it's the divine as it manifests in the finite structure. Existence as we know it in Biyah has another element. It's not divine, it's not a divine structure, it's now a structure that has its own identity. Chachma, Bina, and the spheres of Atzilus have an identity, but they're not their own identity. They're the identity of Elokus as he manifests through these spheres. That's the interface. So we have a place to meet. To put it in Poshet, simple Avedadic terms, very simple. We have a mind. We have emotions, right? Our mind is often used for our own interests, to run a business, to manage our lives. You know, people use Chachma Bina, people use their wisdom for all kinds of things. You could also use wisdom for not good things. We have emotions, the same thing. What's expected of us is to connect to Alakus. So how do you connect to Alakus? God is Bleakvul. So the Eibishter said, here's Atzilus. I'm creating a reality where we can meet. Why? Because when you sit down and learn Torah, that Torah is my Chachma. So you're meeting me, my divine Chachma is meeting human Chachma. When you go and give someone tzedakah and chesed, do a chesed, you're taking your emotional chesed, which is yours, and you could have used it for other things. And it's a chesed of a yesh anivra, and you're aligning it with my chesed. Ma ato chanun, mahu chanun, afato chanun. Mahu rachum, afato rachum. If we didn't have Atzilus, where do we meet? The only place we can meet is if we lose our entire identity and tell God, whatever you want, I'll do. But the Eibishter wants us to meet him in a place that fits our structure. So he created a divine structure, which on one hand is divine, on the other hand, it has structure. We can meet now the Eibishter in that place. So we have it on our terms, but it's divine nonetheless. So you have here an interface. It speaks both languages. The language of Elokus, in it lies the whole Ein Sof that we learned before, concealed. And it also speaks our language because we can relate to the word Chachma. We're not Chachma of Atzilus, but I understand the word Chachma. That from there was Nishtalshel. After many, many levels, Nishtalshel Mehen, the Chachma in my mind, the Bina in my mind, the Das, Chesed, Gvura, Teferes. So the 10 spheres serve as the true interface between existence that's a self-contained yesh and aniva afsi aid, where you can say, I don't need anybody, I care only about me. We now can align our structure with the divine structure, which in turn connects it to the divine essence, if you wish, or the Ein Sof. To use the example of the art, God created this world like an artist. The world is God's art. But now do we know that or we're not aware of that? When we become aware, then we align ourselves and we say, 1 second, I want to be part of God's picture by doing what he wants me to do. So the art is God's way of creating a structure. Within the art, we know lies all the possibilities, the infinite possibilities and beyond of the artist. The way we can grasp, where we have a tfisa, where we have a way of identifying with this is through the structure of the art. And that leads the structure, that we align our structure to that art, to the God structure, and that ultimately creates that mamutza interface that joins and fuses the two. Okay. Now remember, of course, a key element is to remember that God created us as a yesh with pchira, at Adam and Chava, not eaten from the tree of knowledge, the world would have been aligned with the way God wanted it to be, God's art. We learn in Basar Ligani. He says, it was all aligned. But since we have Bechira, and we're a Yesh, and we could choose to wander away, so we can take a world, our world, and the universe, and not and let it be not aligned with the way God intended it to be. And that's, of course, the Aveda that we have is to align it. Atzilus is the template and the perfect model which we need to connect with. Align Asiya, B'riya Yitzir Asiya to Atzilus, which in turn obviously becomes interface to connect it to that which is higher than Atzilus. Okay, I hope that's clear.
So, Rabbi Jacobson, two questions. One is that the Sefiros of Atzilus, do they know their source? Are they aware of their source? Do they have, like, so to speak, on the most subtlest level, their self-consciousness? Chachma Atzilus, Chesed of Atzilus? Or they just
They never left their source, so you can't talk about them becoming aware of their source. You have to see them like it's like asking a question. The faculty of when you just spoke right now, is your power of speech aware of its source in your soul? The answer would be, you wouldn't say it's aware. You just say it's an expression of it. Obviously, when you say the word aware, it suggests that there's a state when you're not aware, and then you become aware. Like, they are, by their identity is awareness. That's what Chachma is. It's God's wisdom. It's like saying about a tzaddik, let's say they say the Alter Rebbe was aligned exactly to the way things are in Atzilus. A tzaddik. A tzaddik, is he aware, or is he just, that's what he is. It came Friday afternoon, he fell asleep. He didn't need to be aware. He's just aligned to it. So when Avram Avinu did chesed, he was just a walking chesed. So the word awareness needs to be clarified. There's a level of awareness where, for example, the rest of us, we don't know necessarily what God wants of us. You open up a Torah, and the Eibishter says, when you wake up in the morning, say Moida Ani. Or the Eibishter says, do Gemilas Chesed, v'ahavta l'recha kamocha. So now we're aware of what God wants of us. So then we can become aware of aligning ourselves to God. When you talk about a neshama of Atzilus, I wouldn't use that language exactly. If you don't mind, can everybody be mute because it's hard to speak? There's some background. Okay. So bottom line is that a tzaddik, when you read in Tanya, tzaddik Gomer, I wouldn't say he was not aware, he became aware. He is constantly like Oves, Heinen or Merkava, 24/7. They're basically a channel of divine energy flowing into existence. So the highest levels, for sure, I would not use awareness. I would use, that's what they are. It's not like two entities. So Chachma, especially in Atzilus, I don't know if I'd use the word awareness. I would use more, this is God's channel. It's like an instrument completely aware, like a chariot that is completely focused and bottled to whoever's riding that chariot. So it's not a yesh that was bottled. It's chetchila, a state of bittul. That's how I would explain it. But on lower levels, on lower levels, you can talk about a mitzias or a yesh that becomes aware. But like when you say Erein Sof, Lifnei Tzimtzum, it's aware of its divine, or it just is a state of awareness of the divine. You see the difference? One is a state of being, a noun, and one is a verb. Are you using awareness as a verb or as a noun? If it's a noun, then it's your state of being. That's what Chachma is. As a verb, I would use it on lower levels.
So when you said Chachma me'ayim tamatzeh, and you said there is a chidush in the kelim of Atzilus, what is that chidush?
First of all, the kelim. Where'd you get the word kelim?
I thought that's what you were saying. The kelim of Atzilus were
I didn't say. No, you missed the second half of the sentence. I said first he explains kelim, then he says also oir. So we're talking about oir and kelim. Okay, well go ahead.
But the kelim, I thought, had a level of me'an to matzeh, of a chiddush.
So we go back to the beginning of Ayin Beis. I cited it earlier. The beginning of Ayin Beis, he says Ayin to matzeh goes also on the oir of Chachma, not just the kelim.
And so there's no distinction between, they have the both levels.
No, there is a major distinction, but that's not the discussion in this mimer. I have to tell you where to look in Ayin Beis. There's whole Maimarim just on the distinction between the level of Eir of Chachma and the Keli of Chachma.
I thought you referred to that earlier in today's class.
And I said both of them are Ayin to Matzah. Yeah, also both the Eir.
And the other question.
And 1 second. So the word Chidush is not Mitzad Chachma. The Chidush is Mitzad Ein Sof. The Ein Sof should manifest in a particular garment. That's a Chidush. That's why Chachma Ayin to Matzah. Okay, go ahead.
And the second question: when we align ourselves, when we take an esrog in this world and physical esrog, and you said that the eloquence of being Hashem and Atzilus, align ourselves completely with it. The esrog as it exists in Atzilus and the esrog that we actually connect, God try to connect to or who do connect with the Eibishter on this level, where does that actual connection occur with the physical esrog that we use in Olam Asiya? How does it get up into Atzilus?
Who says it gets up in Atzilus? Who says it has to get up into Atzilus?
I thought that's the whole idea, that we do a mitzvah down here in Olam
He's not
Asiya.
talking about Gashmi's becoming Ruchnius here. He's not discussing. He's talking about that the physical world is used as an instrument of God's. So when you use an esrog, or for that matter, any physical object aligned with what the Torah says, so you're aligning the energy of esrog into the physical esrog. Whereas if you use it for something else, it's not aligned. So it's like using a hammer. Are you using it for what God wants you to use, or are you using it for other purposes? In Kunter Sachrin, in the Maimer, I think one of the in Kunter Sachrin and Tanya, he actually discusses at length this process. But relevance here is basically aligning ourselves toward God's kavanah. Is it whether it's through chesed, like doing a chesed, or whether it's a mitzvah gashmis? We're not talking about the gashmis so much of it. We're talking about what you're using it for, toward what purpose, to what end. So when we say kol ma shabara kadosh baruch hu be'elamei le'bara elo l'chvedei, that everything God created only for His honor. So when you use your smartphone, when you use your mobile, you use your technology for spreading Chassidus, what you're doing is aligning the energy within that originates from Atzilus with the way it's in Atzilus and all the way back to Elikus. The physical Gashmi is the key chiddush, because Atzilus is not the Kavanah. The Kavanah is Dira B'Tachtenim. Atzilus is not a chiddush because Atzilus is Elikus in the first place. Atzilus doesn't have any, in that sense, Atzilus doesn't have to work on aligning itself. It's already aligned. What the purpose of Atzilus is to give us a template how to align a world of a yesh, which is our world, in every possible way with the divine. But obviously there's going to be a big chiddush in Dafka, this world. The chiddush of Dira B'Tachtenim. That does not happen in Atzilus. Atzilus is not Tachtenim. So the physical esrog adds a dimension that is connected, the yesh hanivra to the yesh hamiti. What we're discussing is aligning it towards God's kavanah. Not so much, we're not talking about turning physical into spiritual, even though in Indian you're aligning matter to spirit. That's what you're really doing. Matter is being aligned with energy, so they become one. When the esrog is used for what God created it, the physical matter is now a keli for the spiritual kavanah.
So that would be the Chiddush of Matan Torah, where it says the Tachtonim was given permission, so to speak, to raise up and integrate with Elyonim, versus what the opposite.
We're moving to another subject that has nothing really to do with this discussion here too much.
No, the only reason I was
what you're asking is a whole different question. I'm talking about aligning ourselves to God's kavanah, aligning our chachma to God's chachma. You're now discussing the transformation of physicality. You see the difference?
Yes.
So the transformation of physicality is another sugya. It's connected only in the sense that it's all part of our avodah. But here we're talking about using your physical mind and learning Torah. What you're doing is aligning yourself with Chachma of Atzilus. When you do Chesed, you're aligning yourself with Chesed of Atzilus. Now there's another aspect to this, that you're actually transforming a yesh of Tachtenim. You don't mind, just put it on mute because it's hard to talk. There's a lot of turbulence. Okay. There's another aspect which is transforming the physicality of it, that on its own it's a yesh, is chumri, in a way that it senses itself, ein le'ilah v'siba, it feels completely independent of God. So there's transforming that something that's completely independent feels itself connected to God, and this is another element, that you're transforming materialism into a divine expression. So there's two different things here. We're talking here more the structure of aligning it to Chachma Bina here, which is obviously necessary, not as much as the actual transformation of physical world toward the Kavanah. So you really need both things.
The first thing that Eliezer said about if the Chachma feels the souls, the Rebbe Rashabi, the page before, is saying that his Chachus is because Eino Margish es HaMekoiroi, but then he said, Eze is Chachus Mamesh, Hare Margish Shenimshach Meize Moker.
Right. Yep. Correct. I'll just read one more line just to finish the topic, and we'll stop here. So he says, so the Sefiros are mamutza, an interface. Why? Because they have both elements. On one hand, their structure, Hagbala. On the other hand, they're Elikus Mamish. Ukamoya Keiches, going back to the muscle, like the faculties. Shein Chutz La'atzmus HaNefesh. On one hand, they're outside of the core soul, because the core soul is beyond structure. B'chinas Keiches Mamish. They're actual faculties, like the spheres are actual spheres. And nevertheless, they're not outside faculties like you're using a hammer. It's the faculties, they're soulful faculties. Faculties of the spirit from the muhus, from the same personality of the nefesh. So they're not the entire nefesh, but they're expressions of the nefesh. So that's the two sides to the 10 spheres, the two sides to the keiches. I'll do is stop here. So we're stopping at